It is April 1861. The Confederacy and the Union are just about to go to war with each other. In the real timeline, this will start the US Civil War, lasting 4 years and causing over 600,000 dead. In the end, the South lost. But in this scenario, things take a strange turn. Just as war is about to begin, the South receives a massive upgrade. Through time and space, the South gets sent M16 assault rifles, equal in number of muskets it had. Basically, every Southern soldier gets one. 100 million bullets included, equal in numbers the South had. How would this change history? Who would win, and how long would the war last? Salutations! Remember our plushie? It's almost sold out and there's not gonna be another run. So if you wanna grab one, now's the time. Crowdmade has a 15% store-wide sale, so our plushies and 2 new cool t-shirts are cheaper than ever. Feel free to check out our Crowdmade store. The link is available down below in the video description. The plushie is just the right size for your desk or your shelf, or you could just make it a gift for people close to you. T-shirts and the plushie will be on sale from November 24th to December 1st, so hurry up. Just before the Civil War, which side had what in 1861? At the start of April, the South had 50 or so thousand volunteers, the North around 16,000 troops. Both rapidly expanded. By late July, the South had 86,000 mustered, while the North, mobilizing faster, fielded a total of 186,000. Yet Union troops were scattered across the country, and assembling a large, coordinated army took time. Most of the early battles were relatively small, with only a few thousand troops per side. Even in the biggest battle of 1861, both troops and officers were inexperienced. Each side had over 30,000 men present, yet only about half actually fought. Officers struggled to control such large forces. So beyond firepower, leadership and organization mattered greatly. Still, the difference between a musket and an M16 is staggering. In 1861, most soldiers still used muzzle-loading smoothbore muskets. Now imagine a Union soldier firing 2 or 3 rounds per minute, with 15 to 25 seconds needed to pour gunpowder, insert the ball, and prime the lock mechanism. A Confederate armed with an M16 could fire 30 rounds in seconds, then reload in seconds more. The rifle the South receives is the M16A2, the standard US military weapon of the 1980s and 1990s. It's the basic model, no advanced sights, grenade launchers or bayonets. The A2 version is tougher, more precise, and limited to semi-automatic and 3-round burst automatic mode. It also far outclasses the musket in range and accuracy. Smoothbores fired round balls that quickly lost energy and were wildly inaccurate, with only half the M16's muzzle velocity. M16's round flies a flatter trajectory, and the rifle actually has an adjustable sight for various distances. The Springfield 1842, the Union's most common weapon at the time, had a fixed sight for one average distance. 3 or so times fewer Springfield 1855s, rifled muskets using a bullet-like mini-ball, were also available. Most soldiers on both sides were volunteers with limited experience, and none in the South had ever seen a modern rifle. Yet after Fort Sumter, 2 months passed before the first real battles. That would give the Confederates time to learn. Some would master the weapon, train others, and spread the knowledge. They would not reach modern military standards, but for 1861 they would be adequate. We have said the South would receive as many M16s as it had muskets, each rifle appearing in their supply chain the moment a musket would have in the original timeline. And for every musket gunpowder charge produced, another 5.56mm round appears instead for the M16s, with some magazines included. We have rough estimates of Southern ammunition output. The Augusta Works, by far Confederacy's largest gunpowder producer, reached full capacity by April 1862. It made close to 3 million pounds of gunpowder, of which 960,000 pounds were used for muskets. enough for 99 million Enfield musket shots. For context, at Gettysburg the South fired around 3 million musket shots, with fewer than 150 shots per casualty. Extrapolating across the entire war's Union casualties, that gives a total of roughly 60 million rounds fired, so 100 million might suffice. These M16 rounds would arrive gradually through the time portal. As said, instead of every musket, the South gets an M16. Historically, the South imported most of its small arms. The total inventory, excluding captured rifles, was around 850,000. Historians estimate around 1 million Confederate men served during the war, nearly 900,000 in the army, so that figure aligns as well. In our scenario, the South receives new rifle at roughly the pace modeled after the pace of South new soldier recruitment, tens of thousands per month until July, then 100,000 over each of the next 6 months, grand total being 850,000 assault rifles. By the original timeline's summer of 1861, the Confederacy had gathered around 100,000 troops. Numbers rose sharply into the 1862, then leveled off. The North, meanwhile, kept fielding nearly twice as many men. But having a weapon and using it are two different things. The South's army was built for defense, to protect its new nation from invasion. Early on, most fighting was limited to small Union incursions into Confederate territory. It wasn't until 1862, after the North's first major offensive failed, that the South dared to strike back. That counterattack became the Maryland Campaign, an attempt not to wound the North's industry, but to show strength and, if possible, threaten Washington, D.C., sending a political message. Even then, some Southern politicians and generals opposed such bold action. In this new timeline, however, news of the Confederacy's mysterious new rifle could terrify the North. Heavy early losses might make Union leaders hesitate, delaying or even canceling their 1862 offensive. The war might get a bit frozen right there. If the Union would go ahead, the battles would likely end even worse for the North, and they would embolden South's General Lee to push even deeper into Union territory. In the original timeline, that push culminated in the Battle of Antietam, where the North held nearly twice as many troops. The Union stopped Lee's advance, but at a heavy cost. Battles of the era were still fought in Napoleonic style, dense lines of soldiers firing mass volleys. Muskets fired slowly and lacked accuracy, so armies relied on concentrated fire rather than precision. The newer rifled muskets were not recognized in time as more deadly due to their accuracy, and even those still produced clouds of thick smoke that blinded both sides. Soldiers would sometimes fire blindly into the haze. Now imagine that same smoke-filled chaos but with M16s. Confederate troops would still shoot into the enemy's smoke, but from far greater distances, and at a few times or 10 times the rate. Union fire would be slower and aiming at a broader area, further diminishing its deadliness. At first, Southern commanders would still fight in the old style, lines, volleys, and close formations, but quickly they would see what works and what doesn't. With 30 rounds ready to fire and fast reloads, line ranks would disappear. Units would spread out, but as handling a few hundred troops in one long line is cumbersome, units would get smaller and would move more freely. Coordinating so many small units would be hard. They would still be superior to the North's units, but plausibly less effective than even World War II's units, which could rely on radio communication. This shift could spark improved tactics, small, fast-moving runner units striking from multiple directions. Cavalry, already about 20% of the Southern Army, would become even more vital. Mounted troops could race behind enemy lines, dismount, and open fire with devastating effect. Even mounted attacks could be attempted, not traditional charges, but rapid flanking attacks with quick retreats, like Mongol horse archers. The South would face serious problems too. One of the first, wasting ammunition. Troops might fire wildly instead of aiming carefully, exactly why the M16 lost its full auto mode after Vietnam. Even so, a 30-round magazine could be emptied in about 5 seconds. In the original timeline, a Confederate soldier carried roughly 60 rounds, with another 140 allotted for them in the unit's wagon train. Even without aiming, it would take nearly 2 hours to fire all that. In practice, those 200 musket rounds often lasted days. With M16s, however, a soldier could burn through the same amount in under 2 minutes. Realistically, discipline and instructors would improve over time, but ammunition use would still be several times higher than in the real timeline, especially early in the war. Earlier we said 100 million rounds would arrive gradually for 850,000 rifles, but with higher consumption, shortages could appear by 1862, before stricter fire control takes hold. Using Antietam's estimated ratio of shots per casualty, the South may have fired 1.5 million musket rounds there. With M16s, that could easily translate to 5 or 10 million, unsustainable levels. Another challenge would curb that waste: maintenance. Soldiers would quickly learn they still have to clean their rifles, but keeping them operational would be far harder. A musket had about 24 parts, an M16 over 100. Disassembly, cleaning, and reassembly would confuse many troops, especially early on with few instructors available. Lubrication would be a problem too. The fine tolerances of modern rifles require proper oils. 1860 substitutes like lamp oil or animal fat would eventually gum up the works. Whale oil, the closest equivalent to modern-day lubricant, might help, but it wasn't widely available. Then there's wear and tear. Various springs, gas rings, and other small parts would fail first, leading to jams. While the South's industry might reproduce a few simple replacements, production would be too slow and limited. A recycling system would emerge. New rifles from the time portal go to veterans, while older worn-out guns are cannibalized for spare parts. Predicting rifle lifespan in 1960s conditions is difficult. Depending on use and care, an M16 might last between a few thousand and 10,000 rounds between replacement. Early in the war, abundant rifles would hide the problem, but as years pass, maintenance failures would grow, and not every soldier would have a working M16 by the end. None of this would prevent the South from dominating battles in 1862. Missouri fought on its own, not part of the Confederacy, so it won't get M16s. In Kentucky, an undecided state, the South would prevail, possibly taking control of much of the state by 1862. Historically, Southern seizure of some towns and construction of forts along the Mississippi actually pushed Kentucky into the Union. In this timeline, whether the South would commit resources to take the capital, Frankfort, is uncertain. Smaller undecided states like Maryland and Delaware would still fall quickly to the Union. Politically, the South was determined to be defensive in the war's first year. They wanted to secede from the Union, not invade it. So early on, little would change. States would join the Confederacy at the same pace. In May and June 1861, Union forces attacked Northwest Virginia, which was lightly defended and sparsely populated. Regardless of how far south goes in Kentucky, Tennessee would remain secure, avoiding the North's attack seen in spring 1862. The South could also send help to Missouri's State Guard, prolonging the fight and possibly taking Jefferson City, though crossing the Missouri River might remain too costly. Meanwhile, in April 1862, the Union Navy captured New Orleans. This would likely repeat in the alternate timeline. The thing is, the South was completely surprised and didn't expect ships could break through the Mississippi, past the forts, disembark 5,000 troops, and assault the city directly. New Orleans did have 3,000 auxiliary troops, a lot of them mixed race, with no experience. Those simply surrendered. With M16s, those defenders who wanted to resist could do so more effectively, but ship-based cannon fire would make many flee. Ultimately, the North had more troops to add later on, more quickly than the South could redirect a decent force to help retake New Orleans. On the Eastern Front, Union pushes into Virginia in summer of 1862 would likely suffer disastrous losses in this timeline. By then, it was clear the Union aimed for a total war. Mere defense would no longer suffice. In the real timeline, after a series of Southern defensive and counter-offensive victories, General Lee entered Maryland, only to be stopped at Antietam, the bloodiest single day of the war. In this alternate timeline, those early victories would be more decisive. Much lower Southern casualties and Northern panic over the new rifle could tip the scale heavily. So let's assume Lee's Maryland campaign here starts months earlier. The Battle of Antietam happens earlier and the North loses badly. Then what? South's goal with the Maryland campaign was political. Besides supplies, it was also to influence the North's upcoming midterm elections. It was to encourage the British and the French to recognize the Confederacy, maybe convince Maryland to join the South. Next, Lee could follow a route similar to Gettysburg a year later. This time the North would likely have fewer units opposing it, and it would be a rout. Lee would go on. Encircling Washington would be logical, though taking it would be slow due to its fortifications. Union's capital might simply relocate, Philadelphia for example, while the Union continues mobilizing. A siege of first Baltimore, then Washington would take time. The South would face logistics and artillery issues, and North would keep resupply via the sea. It would not be a quick victory. The North could use its plentiful territory to buy time. It had vast advantages, a larger population, and a far bigger economy. Most industry was in the North. The South held just 15% of pre-war factories and 8% of iron production. Before the war, the South held 2/3 of U.S. exports, and cotton made up 75% of South's trade. Said near monopoly meant the South hoped Britain or France would intervene, but that support never came. The Southern economy, cropped and slave-based, was ill-suited for war, unlike the industrialized North, which vastly outproduced the South in weapons. South's banking was also weak, offering little help financing the war. New Orleans showed the limits of South's defense. Union ships were fast enough and armored enough to sail past the South's forts and coastal guns. In this timeline, holding the Mississippi forts longer might delay the Union, but North's growing fleet would eventually prevail. Mississippi was at places a mile wide, and cannons had trouble damaging ships, let alone ironclads. No assault rifle would help against the North's ships. The South had just a token navy, smaller, slower ships with lighter, mostly smoothbore guns. The North began the war with 3 times more ships, and by year's end increased its fleet 6-fold with 5 times more guns. Mobile ironclads and rifled guns gave the Union near total control of rivers and the seas. By late 1862, much of the Mississippi River would still fall, leaving only a narrow section under Southern control. The South might retake territory around New Orleans, but not the city itself, thanks to the Union's favorable ship-firing positions. But more crucially, the sea blockade around all the South states would start being felt more and more, just like in the original timeline. As in reality, it would drastically reduce exports, with cotton dropping 95%. Small runner ships could slip through, but those carried limited cargo. Shortages of essentials like bread and medicine would worsen. In the real timeline, the entire Mississippi River was taken by July 1863, severing Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas from the rest of the Confederacy, also limiting cattle and pig supplies. The new timeline would see the same, perhaps several months later. Production disparities extended to artillery. Including naval guns, the North outproduced the South 5 to 6-fold. Southern guns were largely 12-pounder Napoleons, old, less accurate smoothbores. Northern rifled cannons grew steadily more accurate, some capable of hitting targets within a foot from 1,800 yards. As the war would go on, the South would use its assault rifles more wisely. Cavalry raids would target North's artillery and supply units, keeping the Union land units on the defensive. Morale effects are harder to predict. Historically, the North had roughly twice as many deserters, 200,000 versus South's 100,000, but also it had over twice the troops. Still, with the South performing better, Northern desertions would likely rise, even proportionally. We can't know what would happen once Washington would fall. It would probably not take place before mid-1863 due to naval resupply. Its capture might prompt peace talks, potentially mediated by Britain and France, which the South would see as a victory. Alternatively, the North could realize just how much economic damage it's doing to the South and notice the South can't actually produce rifles and ammo to infinity. It could continue fighting, though adapting a very defensive posture first. Even with assault rifles, attacking entrenched positions would be difficult. Dug-in troops, cannons and superior numbers would force the front line into a long fortified trench line. Biding its time, the North could wait as the naval blockade keeps strangling the South. The South couldn't go much further in Maryland. Above Baltimore is the Susquehanna River, another often half a mile wide obstacle. Here it would further be fortified along its northeastern bank. Advancing north towards Pittsburgh would lead through hard-to-fight-in hills and forests, and then the South would eventually reach massive trench lines and fortifications. Further offensives would increase Southern casualties, risk desertions, and strain political support at home. The North also added more modern rifles during the war. No, not the Gatling gun, available just in token numbers from 1864, and no, not the Springfield 1861, a famous rifled musket using mini-balls, but still a muzzle-loading design with a low fire rate. Also not the revolving rifles, essentially a rifle version of a revolver, which were used in small numbers early on, but were prone to failure and were unpopular. Real progress came with repeating rifles. By 1860, two models started limited production, but serious numbers took years. The Henry rifle saw only 14,000 made by 1866. The Spencer rifle, however, was industrially produced, around 106,000 used by the Union during the war, mostly carbines for cavalry. Repeating rifles could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute, a massive improvement over 2 to 3 shots from a Springfield. In the real timeline, Spencer rifles appeared late due to politics and lack of urgency, seeing limited use at Antietam. There they had some issues requiring design improvements. After a presentation to Lincoln in August 1863, production ramped up rapidly. In this alternate timeline, with North's panic, such advanced rifles would likely be embraced immediately, even if they were a few times more expensive, possibly entering mass production by the start of 1862. Of course, even the Spencer rifle is no match for the M16 when compared directly, but using it as a part of the Union system compared to the South's system, much of the M16's edge would be eroded. While an M16 still outclasses a Spencer, the gap narrows when considering battlefield use. Soldiers must aim and react to enemy fire. Several seconds between shots is typical. Against a musket, that's still a huge advantage. Against a Spencer, the conditions mentioned neutralize much of the M16's raw rate of fire advantage. The South would eventually assign some machine gunners to lay down suppressive fire using the burst mode. The North could not match that directly, but could offset it with superior troop numbers and much greater artillery support. Out in the open, the North would still lose most battles. That would quickly push it into a defensive posture, digging those trenches years earlier than in the real timeline, by 1862 instead of 1864, stretching for hundreds of miles. Assaulting trench lines was no small feat in 1864. Famous example is the so-called Siege of Petersburg. The North, with twice the troops, several times the artillery, and growing numbers of repeating rifles, failed to break the South's defenses for 9 months. Reversed here, the South would face the same problem, attacking fortified Union lines with not much more than half the troops, far fewer cannons, and very little siege artillery. Even the M16's edge over a mix of muskets and Spencer rifles wouldn't be enough. The front would thus grind forward slowly, each advance meeting a new trench. Eventually, the North's lines would stabilize. Its troops would be nearly fully equipped with repeaters, its artillery outnumbering the South several times to one, while the South would be starving under its fifth year of total blockade. Confederation states west of Mississippi would wage their own little war, taking mostly empty land until exhaustion sets in. Total casualties would surpass the real timeline. The South would lose far fewer early on, though disease and accidents would still kill many. The North's losses would soar, probably well over 1.5 million versus the South's 675,000 as seen in this speculative table. Maybe enough for unrest in the North, but probably not enough for surrender. Population percentage-wise, the North would still be better off. The South would operate fewer and fewer M16 rifles as they would break down. But that alone wouldn't make the South run out of firepower. Those 100 million rounds would still run out first. Depending on how many shots are expended to cause a casualty, it might run out of ammo between 1865 and 67. Now, even if further ammo is provided to the South would be on the defensive, as it would be out of pretty much everything else. The war might last a few years more, with more casualties, but eventually the North would win and retake all the states, even if it lasted past 1870. Ultimately, the South has no path to independence. Even if the North sues for peace after Washington falls, the Confederacy would stay impoverished and unindustrialized. Sure, the blockade would be no more, but you can't live off cotton alone. M16s would wear out and ammo would get spent. Actually using captured rifles and ammo is the North's industry that could profit more, learn from the M16 and mass-produce something more advanced than the Spencer rifle. Animosity between North and South would fester for a few decades, and when the North would grow strong enough again, another war would likely reunite the nation, this time with no Britain or France to meddle, both consumed by the World War I. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.